Hello everyone, and welcome to the Lives and the Thought of the Philosophers. I wanted to take a moment to introduce the lecture series by answering the following two questions. What is the goal of this series, and what is the structure and approach of the lectures? The goal of the series is simple: to present the lives and the thought of philosophers, or schools of thought, in an accessible manner, so that a broader audience has access to philosophy's benefits. Of course, it's my assumption that philosophy is in fact beneficial, enriching, and even empowering. But this raises the question, is philosophy currently inaccessible? My answer is yes. I do think that philosophy today is less accessible than it used to be, and there are a number of reasons that contribute to this. I'd like to focus on just two: the professionalization of philosophy and the low esteem in which philosophy is held, at least in the United States, today. This isn't to say that philosophy used to be extremely accessible. No, in fact, philosophy always has had a sort of intellectual bar. Philosophy likely always will be intellectually demanding. But a few factors have made the task of approaching philosophy for the first time much more difficult. So, what do I mean by the professionalization of philosophy, and why is it a problem? The professionalization of philosophy marks the moment that philosophy shifted into a strict academic discipline. Immanuel Kant is a prime example of this shift. With the rise of the German educational institution and philosophy's subsequent absorption in this institution, to be a philosopher approximately also meant to be a professor. To some extent, the shift also marks a formalization of the approach one could take in philosophy. To stick with the example of Kant, the task of philosophy was to create a system that explained humanity and the world, a sort of theory of everything. In fact, this is precisely what Kant believed he had achieved in his work, The Critique of Dialectical Reason. He believed he had wedded the sciences and what we'd call psychological life to each other in such a way as grounded the entire world of knowledge. Of course, it's questionable whether or not he achieved this goal, even in his own time. But one thing he did manage to do was set off an entire decades-long attempt to clarify, challenge, and usurp his position. So, when subsequent thinkers came along, the language of academic philosophy grew more specialized, particularly around what he had instigated. Contrast this with ancient Greek or Chinese philosophy. For example, in the Warring States period, China was experiencing unprecedented social turmoil. Various schools of thought arose to try and find solutions to the social unrest, such as Lao Tzu's Taoism and Kong's Confucianism. Both were concerned with the question of how to properly live, though, of course, they stressed different approaches. Taoism believed the solution was for individuals to literally abide in the way of nature. By following nature's inherent process, social unrest would simply dissipate, because social unrest was the product of human conflict and suffering, insofar as people had strayed from the natural order. In contrast to this bottom-up approach, Confucianism opted for a top-down approach. Confucianism believed the solution was to posit and follow a strict ethical code surrounding an individual's right conduct towards themselves, their family, their friends, and to the state. By rectifying this conduct, the product would naturally be a peaceful social order. Regardless of which approach is correct, the question was a matter of living correctly, and the effects of these two schools of thought are still present in Chinese culture today. Another pertinent example, of course, is ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Socrates. As is well known, Socrates never committed his philosophy to writing. Plato took up this task. Instead, Socrates lived his philosophy, first and foremost by going into Athens' marketplace and engaging others in philosophical dialogue. Numerous schools of thought followed Socrates' example, such as the Stoics, who took to practicing their philosophy on the porch, the stoa in Greek, of the agora. Even Aristotle's academy, which is readily comparable to today's university structure, was known as the Peripatetic school, after Aristotle's habit of teaching his students while walking. This picture stands in stark contrast to contemporary philosophy. Most anyone with a little patience can pick up Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or Chuang-Tzu's Inner Chapters, engage with them, and immediately take something from them readily applicable to their own lives. It's a whole other matter to pick up David Lewis's On the Plurality of Worlds, struggle through its dense language, and derive principles by which one can live. I'd even venture to guess that a number of listeners have never even heard of David Lewis. I don't mean to suggest that real philosophy falls within the domain of ethics and that all else is bunk. By no means. But when's the last time that academic philosophy produced an ethics that radically transformed a society's way of life? I would suggest, rather, that the professionalization of philosophy has made it extremely difficult for philosophy and the public to meaningfully communicate. This brings us to the low esteem in which philosophy is held today, and one can trace this development particularly with the rise of science and philosophy's response to its predominance. Stephen Hawking famously said that philosophy is dead. What matters is science. What matters is science's developments, its conclusions. This sentiment runs rampant in philosophy today. Analytic philosophy in particular is obsessed with scientific method. In the most extreme cases, this produces confused, indeed ugly, theories of human nature. Take, for example, functionalism and its repeated comparison of the human brain to computers, as if, first, human beings could be reduced to their brains, their mental states, and second, as if these mental states could further be analyzed and broken down into predictable algorithms. In this view, human beings are nothing more than complex meat machines. It's only a matter of time before the apparatus is fully fleshed out and utterly predictable. Again, I don't mean to suggest that the adoption of scientific methodology is necessarily wrong, nor that it is a necessarily recent development. Leaving aside the fact that science, for the longest time, simply was what was called natural philosophy, one can see, for example, in Nietzsche, a successful adoption of science's rigorousness. In fact, this rigorousness provided Nietzsche with the means to challenge the otherworldliness that dominated the philosophy of his day, an otherworldliness he charged as being the byproduct of Christian metaphysics. Using a kind of methodological naturalism, as the philosopher Brian Leiter calls it, Nietzsche was able to ferret out this Christian otherworldliness in all of its guises, be it in the idea of the ego, the assumption of a mind-body duality, or Kant's thing in itself. But even then, Nietzsche was extremely critical of science and warned against its adoption as a replacement system following the abandonment of Christian metaphysics. It seems as if no one listened to his warning. Today, in the United States, we have a particularly confusing situation. Individuals either subscribe to scientism, by which I mean the faith that science provides solutions to all human problems, to Christianity, or to the utterly confusing adoption of both worldviews, as if they were compatible. Focusing on the effects of scientism, philosophy, insofar as it ceases to trail the sciences to clarify inconsistencies, is often seen as an eccentric pursuit. Coupled with the dominant values in society, success, fame, and wealth, philosophy anymore is simply viewed as either anachronistic or a downright waste of time. If it doesn't land a good job, then it's not worth doing. Of course, science, or better, the faith in science, will never succeed in explaining away the vagaries of human experience. Luckily, life is too rich for that. For example, imagine going to a concert with your friend, only to have the band give you a stack of paper quantifying the set list as a mere collection of sound waves over time. What's more, the set list is ranked on a 100-point scale, with accurate predictions of your reaction to each song. You liked the opener, but the second song only ranked a 58 for you, and this negatively impacted the remainder of the concert. Most of you wouldn't be content with this. You would have much rather listened to the band's set, no matter how exhaustive of a report that they could provide you with. As silly as this example might be, it does suggest a limit to science's scope and range in human experience. But I'm more concerned with the following, and indeed this is one of the fundamental reasons that drove me to start this lecture series. As I said earlier, it's my assumption that philosophy is in fact beneficial, enriching, and even empowering. It gives a person autonomy, the skills and know-how to transcend one's situation, and the ability to take an active role in lucidly developing one's future. That is, philosophy is liberating. But if this is true, and if it is likewise true that access to philosophy is restricted by technical language, college admission requirements, and even one's socio-economic status, indeed, if one's dominant culture constantly resists one's drive for personal development, then, for me, it becomes a question of oppression. To use an example, the Catholic Church held privileged access to the Bible for hundreds of years because only clergy and the highly educated could read Hebrew and Greek. This gave the church an extraordinary amount of power not often used to people's benefit. While the current situation of academic philosophy and dominant American values isn't similar to institutional Catholicism, the effects may be the same. If people do not have access to the tools they need to rapidly transform their lives, and if those who study philosophy are aware of this lack of access and do nothing to overcome it, then at the very least we have a form of oppression through voluntary inaction. Hence I've chosen to align myself with those who actively work to increase the availability and prestige of philosophy. In particular, I have in mind Peter Adamson's podcast series, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, in which Dr. Adamson rectifies the lack of representation of non-Western philosophies, as well as the underrepresentation of women and people of color, a task long overdue. Another podcaster, and someone I greatly admire, is Dr. Wes Cecil, whose lectures tackle a broad range of contemporary and historical philosophical issues, presented in a way that is engaging and accessible. This has had a lasting impact on his listeners. Of course, starting a lecture series is not the only way to challenge the lack of access to philosophy. For example, why is it possible for an undergraduate to complete a bachelor's degree without taking a single philosophy course? Or, better, why is philosophy not taught in high school, as it is in European countries, or as it is in China? Why aren't there more bridge programs between philosophy departments and communities that allow for public outreach? Why are there millions of churches with Sunday school programs preaching a metaphysics of fundamental guilt, rather than just a handful of places dedicated to the love of wisdom and self-empowerment for the youth? But in keeping with an existentialist ethics, each situation, indeed each problem, demands its own original solution. Based on my background, abilities, and interests, this is the solution that I've found. This brings me to the second question. What is the structure and approach of the lectures? I will present these lectures in roughly 1-hour increments, with the first 30 minutes dedicated to the biography or history of a thinker or school of thought. The second half of the lecture will focus on a particular philosophical concept from that thinker or school, presented in a manner as free from jargon and accessible as possible. My intention is that listeners will leave the lecture with something they can readily apply in their own lives. Finally, each lecture, when given publicly, will be followed by a question and answer session where listeners and I can enter into dialogue to clarify any confusion that may arise from the presentation. You might wonder why I've chosen to include biography and history as an element in this lecture series. Isn't it more beneficial to simply present philosophical concepts? What do thinkers' lives have to do with their thought? It's philosophy after all. Give me the ideas. You're not alone if you've asked yourself this question. This is the exact approach taken in academic philosophy. What's important is the philosophy. A thinker's life and historical background are of little to no consequence. I think this is a gross error, however, and I'd like to take a minute to explain why. My current approach to philosophy is informed by phenomenology and existentialism. Both disciplines have worked tirelessly to reestablish the importance of lived experience, which is composed of an individual's history, social status, upbringing, social milieu, and more. Philosophy cannot simply analyze dry concepts such as consciousness, perception, and action without taking into consideration the entire backdrop informing those concepts. If I'm a French intellectual, I do not philosophize in a vacuum. Rather, my entire education informs my particular approach to philosophy, and even a cursory grasp of that educational background will enrich one's understanding of my thought. I believe the phenomenological approach can be carried over into pedagogy as well. The benefits of presenting ideas in context are already a well-known pedagogical device. For example, it's much easier to generate 8th graders' interest in the Pythagorean theorem if it's first presented as an idea developed by an ancient Greek. That this ancient Greek likely learned mathematics in Egypt, only to take that knowledge with him to form a cult, and that in this cult, followers believed he had a golden thigh and was impossible to make laugh. But this approach can be philosophically enriching as well. For example, if you've read Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, you may have come across the famous phrase, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." You may already know that she was an existentialist and argued that humans become who they are through the choices they make, and not through some inherent nature. Nothing but an individual's choices can account for a person being a woman. It's enlightening to know that de Beauvoir lived by these very tenets, and despite being born into bourgeoisie society, she forsook social expectation in order to pursue a life of independence. What's striking, however, is that she also claimed that she met with little resistance throughout her life, despite being a woman pursuing what was still largely seen as a man's career. She claimed her male peers met her with respect and equanimity. This biographical fact raises a question. Was de Beauvoir simply fortunate enough to dodge the hardships most women face? And if so, did she have an ill-informed understanding of what it meant to choose womanliness? Are there, in fact, real forces that govern a person's choice of self, including their gender and gender identity? Forces de Beauvoir simply missed out on because she was fortunate enough to dodge them? Indeed, many feminists have raised objections to de Beauvoir's position, claiming to the contrary that many factors beyond one's control determine one's gender, that it isn't simply choice, and perhaps not simple social coercion either. While it would be groundless to dismiss de Beauvoir based on the life she lived, understanding her biography nonetheless leads to a more enriching conversation of choice, gender, and social conditioning. Thus, presenting a philosopher's biography can be extremely beneficial when presenting to a first-time audience. Finally, I would like to close by saying that I do not have a definitive list of thinkers in mind for this lecture series. I do not have a timetable by which to present these lectures. I do not have a dedicated forum in which to present them, nor do I see a logical end to this series. As much as I am concerned with disseminating philosophy to a larger audience, the lecture genre also allows me to enrich my own understanding of philosophy and to explore my various interests in a meaningful way. This to say, I will give these lectures whenever possible. Ralph Waldo Emerson famously said, "There is properly no history, only biography." I believe what he says is true, insofar as we understand him to mean that history is strictly a human affair. I've laid out my goal and approach to this lecture series, The Lives and Thought of the Philosophers, and in so doing, I believe I've demonstrated confluence with Emerson's sentiment. But Emerson likewise said, "Beware when the great God lets loose a thinker on this planet." I believe my goal is in keeping with Emerson on this point as well. If I am interested in presenting listeners with the living, breathing thought of flesh and blood humans, it's because I aim to give them more than hollow platitudes. By taking up these living thoughts, my hope is that listeners will be empowered to take an active role in the part they play in the great human drama we call life. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me sketch out my goal and approach to this lecture series. As these lectures come out, I hope you find them informative, pertinent, and above all, enriching.